So today's video is going to be on the subject of minimum wage and specifically on whether or not minimum wage should be increased. This is a fairly relevant issue right now, specifically in North America, both in Canada and the United States, because there are a number of different areas and discussions on whether or not minimum wage should go up. And realistically, this is a conversation that does come up around the world as well, so it's important to understand what the benefits are and what the drawbacks can be associated with it. And if you do decide to increase minimum wage, how should it be done so that it limits those drawbacks and has the most positive effect? That's sort of what this video is going to be about today. And the discussion is ultimately going to be focused around Seattle, which is sort of the primary case study for minimum wage increase in the United States. It's a city there, and they've undergone a minimum wage increase in seeing what kind of effects it's had. And then Ontario is a province in Canada that is about to undergo a very significant change to their minimum wage, and talking a little bit about some of the ramifications that can be seen from that. But first thing I want to talk about before I dive into that, there are a few people in the world that feel minimum wage can be done away with altogether. Typically, it's individuals who are libertarian and who feel that the labor market will regulate itself in the sense that people will just not go to jobs where the income goes below a certain amount, and they feel like everything will work out. And ultimately, that's kind of crazy. Minimum wage is incredibly important to have because it protects individuals in our society who are at the highest risk of being taken advantage of by companies. Typically, not in all cases, but typically people who are in minimum wage jobs are going to be individuals who weren't necessarily offered or didn't have the ability to undertake secondary education. They were individuals, typically, say, single parents, who didn't have the money or time to go to school, so they decided to take a job to take care of children. People with disabilities, individuals that are at a higher chance of being taken advantage of by companies are typically the people that are working in these minimum wage jobs. And having a minimum wage is very important to protect those individuals and to ensure that they have livable wages so that they can be a part of society, earn income, pay rent, get food on the table. It's incredibly important. This discussion is not about whether or not we should have minimum wage. There really is an argument against it. It's whether or not it should be increased. And so let's jump into that right now and go through the benefits and also the drawbacks associated with increasing minimum wage. The first benefit, pretty obvious, it increases the buying power of people who are in low income, who generate low income, and are typically in or under the poverty line. So it helps those people out by giving them more money so they can get food and other various things that allow them to live a livable life. So, pretty obvious first benefit. Second one is actually it reduces the burden for social assistance programs offered by the government. When wages increase for low-income individuals, because they have more money, they don't have as much need for government programs. In the United States, things like food stamps, you don't necessarily need that as much when you have higher income. And various other social programs to benefit low-income people, whether it's in the United States or Canada, there's going to be less of a need for them as minimum wage increases. Some would also argue that the government will generate more tax income because people are earning more income, but ultimately that balances out with the fact that companies can actually deduct the higher salary costs, so the tax gains on the personal income side are sort of lost on the business side. So ultimately that balances out, but realistically social benefit needs are going to go down, so that's going to reduce the cost for the government. And the third major benefit of a minimum wage increase is actually it increases and stimulates growth in the economy by increasing consumer demand. Now, you may have heard of a concept known as trickle-down economics. What is this? Well, this was something that was tried a number of years ago, and it was a concept introduced where the government will give huge tax breaks to wealthy individuals, and the expectation was that these wealthy individuals would take this money, they would spend it on things like cars, houses, and various other things, and that ultimately that money would trickle down to the low-income individuals, the manufacturer workers who are making those fancy cars, the construction workers building that home. It failed. It didn't work. It was not an effective strategy, and it did not actually increase growth in the economy. A lot of these very wealthy people would just hoard the money. They would keep it, they would put it in businesses, and it wouldn't typically get reintroduced into the economy. It didn't stimulate growth. It was a failure. But on the other hand, minimum wage increases is an actually effective way to increase growth and consumer spending in an economy. The reason for that, if you increase the salary of, say, a single mom earning $30,000 a year to $40,000, she's going to be spending most of that money in the economy. Ultimately, she might save some for her children's education, but most of that money is going to go towards bettering her and her children's lives. Poor people who get higher income typically are not going to hoard that money away. It's going to get introduced into the economy in spending and various other fashions. So if you are looking to increase growth in an economy, consumer spending growth, increasing a minimum wage is actually a very effective way to do that, and it actually will have a very powerful effect. It will actually work compared to other methods that governments have tried. So those are sort of three of the main benefits that are typically associated with increasing minimum wage. Now, there are two notable drawbacks. There are multiple issues that are created with increased minimum wage, but the two biggest ones are obviously unemployment is going to go up. That's sort of a given. As you increase salary costs, companies are going to look for ways to save that money. So they're going to reduce positions. They're going to get rid of people that at a certain wage it was okay to have them, but as increases go up, they make do without them. They figure out ways for machines to take those positions, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, you're going to see less jobs overall. Second major issue is that small business growth is going to hurt from it. Small businesses are the ones that are most at risk from minimum wage increases, and that is because typically most of their employees are made up of people who are making minimum wage, and typically they also have smaller profit margins than these larger companies, so increases in costs hit them very hard, particularly businesses like restaurants and clothing stores that typically will have a number of minimum wage employees working there. And ultimately you'll see less expansion of these small companies, and you'll see more of them go under compared to previous wage levels. So those are the benefits and drawbacks of the two. Ultimately, it should be done on a case-by-case basis when you're looking at cities, municipalities, regions, on deciding whether the benefits outweigh the negatives. And you can't really do a sweeping, or you shouldn't do a sweeping decision across a country, because the decisions will vary depending on wherever you are. So, with that information, let's sort of break down the two case studies for some of the places this is taking place. Now, Seattle, as I mentioned before, is a city in the United States, and they sort of undertook this decision to increase minimum wage in 2015, and as of January this year, it has risen to $15 an hour. So ultimately, Seattle is a case study on the proper way to increase minimum wage. So let's break down what they did right. First off, it was a gradual increase over a number of years. It increased, it was a set amount, businesses were given time to make decisions, make changes, and incorporate it into their model. And so it was gradual, but the really key issue here is for small businesses, they gave additional time to make those changes. A small business was given until 2021 before they have that $15 minimum wage change. So places like restaurants, clothing stores who are at most risk of being hurt by minimum wage increases were given more time. And this was key. This is how you effectively increase minimum wage. It protects small businesses and gives them time to accommodate and adjust and incorporate that minimum wage change. So that was a very key and important decision for Seattle. And the third major thing or benefit that is going for them in this situation is Seattle is a city. They're one very specific place, and they decided that a $15 minimum wage was appropriate for their municipality. They decided that was an okay and a good, livable wage for them. They were able to do that because that is a very specific region where there is a specific living wage appropriate for it. So they sort of have three benefits. It was a gradual increase. They took into account the fact that small businesses are going to be hurt more than large companies, and it is a very specific region where they decided to do this. So Seattle did it correctly. And ultimately, as mentioned before, they've had benefits, and they have also had those drawbacks. There has been an increase in unemployment. There has been less businesses, and more businesses have been hurting because of it, but ultimately, because they did appropriate steps towards it, those negatives are mitigated, and the positives are sort of amplified. Ontario, on the other hand, is going about it very poorly. They're making some very critical mistakes, and ultimately the changes have not taken place yet, but when they do, they're likely going to have very serious ramifications. So let's break down what they did wrong compared to what Seattle is doing. The first thing, right off the bat, you probably already see it, $11 to $13 over a period of a little bit less than a year. $11.60 to $14 in the period of 3 months. $2.40 change. That is a significant change for a company. And the key here is there is nothing in place to account for small businesses who are at the most risk of being hurt by these changes. Let's actually sort of break this down into an example. Let's say you have a restaurant, and in that restaurant you have 10 employees. Obviously it's going to vary throughout the day when you have employees working, but we'll say it's an average of 10 employees working for every hour in that company. So, $2.40 you're looking at an increase of $24 an hour more costs for that restaurant. Let's say that restaurant is open 10 hours every day. And as I mentioned before, obviously, just for an example's sake, we'll keep it consistent, but it will vary throughout the day. In this hypothetical example, under this current system, in a period of 3 months, that restaurant would see a $240 increase every single day to their costs. That is an incredible hit to them right away. As I mentioned before, these small businesses typically have razor-thin profit margins, where there is not a huge difference between how much money they're taking in and how much money they're spending. And increasing expenses like at this rate is going to be a huge burden on these small companies. And it's coming very fast, and there's not a lot of time to prepare for that. So that is a very huge mistake. This is a huge jump for an increase over a very short period of time. They're not going gradual at all. They're just throwing it out there. And they are not accounting for the fact that small businesses are going to be devastated by this. It is way too fast, and it is not being done properly. And the third and very significant issue with this is, as I mentioned before, Ontario is a province in Canada. So they're not one city. They're not one specific place. They're a province that's made up of a number of large cities, a number of small cities, towns, vast rural areas. And they're proposing a $15 minimum wage by 2019 for the whole province. So that means large cities are going to have it, small towns in the middle of nowhere are going to have it. It is an awful way to go about increasing minimum wage. It should be on a case-by-case basis like Seattle. Seattle went through and said $15 is an appropriate livable minimum wage for our region. Ultimately, there are going to be cities in Ontario, like Toronto, like Ottawa, where a $15 minimum wage is probably appropriate. It is probably a livable minimum wage. But when you look at a small town in Northern Ontario with 500 people, a $15 minimum wage doesn't make sense. It is very inexpensive to live there. So a blanket $15 minimum wage across an entire province is very inappropriate. It should almost always be done on a municipal or regional basis, not on a sweeping sort of province-wide change. So those are 3 things that are going to make it so that if these changes do take place, it's probably going to have very serious negative ramifications for the Ontario economy. When you look at Seattle, the benefits so far have outweighed the negatives. In Ontario, the negatives are probably going to outweigh the benefits because they are making significant mistakes and rushing it out. Now, ultimately, there are other things that do go along with the Ontario wage increase. There are sort of other employment factors tacked onto that. But this is sort of the marquee change, and it is being done in a very inappropriate way, and it's being rushed out in part because it is an attempt by the current government to essentially buy votes, to encourage people to vote for them in the upcoming election, but it is going to have serious ramifications that ultimately could be avoided if they did take an approach like Seattle. So that sort of summarizes this discussion. And one thing that I think a lot of people sort of perceive as a huge issue when it comes to the minimum wage discussion, but I personally don't, is the idea that as minimum wage increases, there's going to be a significant push towards automizing things with machines, with machine learning. So say replacing drivers with robots or self-driving cars and things along those lines. I personally don't actually perceive that as an issue in the minimum wage discussion, and the reality for that is because this is all going to happen anyways. It's all already happening already. Companies are already shifting towards robots, machines that replace people who used to work in those jobs. So I personally don't actually see it as a discussion issue for minimum wage because companies are going to do it regardless of whether changes are made or not. And I'm actually going to make a video in the future that talks a little bit about the upcoming changes that are going to happen in the economy when it comes to automation and what kind of ramifications that are going to happen with that. I am obviously very focused on the finance industry, and I personally find it fascinating seeing the changes that are happening and what kind of shifts are going to happen with the economy because of that. But that sort of wraps up the discussion of minimum wage increases. Obviously, everything should be done by a case-by-case study. It should be at the municipal level. A city should decide on the appropriate minimum wage for its citizens. It should be specific to them. Any changes should be gradual, and there has to be an account for small businesses who are at the highest risk of being hurt by these changes. As always, if you like the content, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. It helps me grow as a channel, and have a wonderful day.